Just to give you a bit of background, I made a video called The Vegan Blind Spot, where I made an argument for why we should help non-humans who are suffering in the wild. Vegan Footsoldier disagreed with parts of what I was saying, and we had a little back and forth with response videos. I thought it could be productive to get Vegan Footsoldier onto my channel and just have a conversation about some of the issues with the idea and see if we can perhaps find some middle ground or even perhaps have our minds changed on certain things. So, Footsoldier, thank you for coming here.
No worries, great to be on. Thanks for inviting me.
Cool. So I thought a good place to start could be with one of the points you made in, I think it was just your second video you made on the topic. And you said that humans invariably make things worse, and that's your main issue with it. So I'm interested, do you still hold this belief, or has your view changed at all?
Well, to understand what we're talking about, the wild animal suffering topic. So we're talking about going into nature and intervene in some way so we can reduce the suffering for the animals in the wild. So for me, there are a couple of questions here. The question that you just raised, will it actually be positive? Could we positively reduce the suffering? Or will it just be a disaster and will make things worse? But there's also other questions such as, why would we want to do that? Is that something we should do? Should we reduce animal suffering? Is reducing animal suffering important? Is it an ethical obligation? Is there a moral obligation? Is there some sort of reason why we should do this? Or is there maybe even a reason why we shouldn't do this ethically? So there are various different questions and approaches. So it's quite a complex topic, but just to address what you brought up in terms of would we make things worse, I think it's quite difficult to say whether we would make things worse because it depends on the specific application. For example, we've successfully reduced the incidence of rabies in wild animal populations, for example, with vaccines, and that's broken the contamination sort of line. So we've had a dramatic reduction in the amount of rabies in wild animals, and that wasn't because of some sort of kindness or moral obligation to wild animals. That was so that humans didn't get bitten by wild animals and get rabies. And so it's not really necessarily something to do with wanting to reduce the suffering in wild animals, but we have done things in the past which has potentially reduced the suffering of wild animals. But you could then argue, well, we've reduced the incidences of rabies transmission in the wild through vaccinations for whatever reason why we did that, whether that was for the animals or for us. But has that gone on to create knock-on effects which have actually made things worse in nature? For example, now that there's less dogs dying of rabies and less bats dying of rabies, maybe there's some knock-on effect that's had, that's contributed to more predation and more quote-unquote wild animal suffering. So it's not only whether we can reduce wild animal suffering or how we would reduce wild animal suffering, but it's whether what we think is going to reduce wild animal suffering is actually going to, in the grand scheme of things, actually do what we set out to do. So it's a very complex question. I think Peter Singer would say maybe we should, but he thinks maybe we can't because we won't know.
Yeah, I agree. It's very complex, and I suppose that's why I'm kind of emphasizing, or the movement to reduce wild animal suffering emphasizes research at this point. Like you said, there's that intervention where they eradicated rabies in foxes, and I know rabies causes a hell of a lot of suffering, so I suppose there's reason to believe it reduced suffering, but like you said, there wasn't good research around the knock-on effects of this, what could potentially happen as a result of this, and that's something that should be sort of looked into. And I think that's perhaps a difference between interventions that would be designed for the purpose of helping wild animals and ones that aren't, because in the intervention you mentioned, well, they're not going to really care about the suffering it might cause to other species, simply because that's not the reason they're going in there in the first place. They're doing it for like a very human-centric view because it affects humans' pets or whatever. So I suppose that's a difference. I mean, do you think if let's say if the empirical data, which doesn't currently exist, did suggest that we could have a specific intervention that was going to reduce suffering. Let's say the evidence suggested it would reduce suffering, and it was also somewhat reversible. So if we were to make a mistake, we could reverse the effects and go back to somewhat being like the previous world. Would you be behind a project like that?
Well, we could talk about the hypothetical imperative of if your goal is to reduce suffering in wild animals, and there is this specific intervention that someone's dreamed up, which would do just that, then you should do that if that is your goal. So if your goal is to reduce wild animal suffering and you can do it, then you should do it. The question is whether, as we just discussed, whether we can actually do it. Like the pragmatic aspect of, can we go into the forest and do things that won't just have worse knock-on effects? Because when you disrupt the ecology, for example, a lot of people have been saying predator animals, they kill all of the herbivorous animals, and it's causing a lot of suffering to be eaten alive by the predator animals. So we should kill the predator animals, or make it so that they're infertile, so we reduce the predator animals. But then what happens if you do that is you're just going to have a huge population boom of the herbivorous animals that were previously preyed upon, and then they're going to run out of resources and they're all going to starve to death. So what's worse, being eaten to death, eaten alive, or starving to death? And so it's sort of like when you interfere with the environment, is always going to have a knock-on effect. There's never going to be one. That's why it's so complex, because there's never going to be one intervention that we can do which is going to guarantee our goal, unless we had like omniscience, or I don't know, if we just knew somehow, if we were like gods and we just knew and we could just be a god and sort of grant it.
Something that keeps happening, I don't know if there's anything you can do about it, but like every couple of seconds your voice kind of turns robotic and gets a bit laggy. But if there's nothing you can do on the spot, then we can just sort of power through. What do you think?
It could be my connection. I can quit and rejoin. One sec.
Okay. Talking, you were saying that if your goal is to reduce wild animal suffering, and we find that we can reduce wild animal suffering, then of course we should do it. But the question is, can we do it? And you talked about the issue of predation, which is extremely complex. And the thing with predation is it's kind of the sexy topic that people like to talk about who aren't in the movement to reduce wild animal suffering. But within the movement to reduce wild animal suffering, it's kind of seen as it's not where we're going to start. We're certainly not going to try and deal with the predation issue, partly because it's so complex with the knock-on effects, but also because of public perception, because it's less likely that the public would get behind something like that. And you talked about a population boom. So if we were to sort of control the population of lions, per se, let's say that then we'd have an issue where the prey species are overpopulating and there's going to be more competition for resources and more starvation. But again, this is something that the movement is very, very much aware of. Like, they're very focused on the risks of doing certain things, and they're not going to cause one species to go out of control, the prey species, without having further population control there. But as I said, I think dealing with the predation issue and population control in that way, it could be more of a complex issue, and perhaps not where they'll start. Where they start, it could be somewhere like overpopulation. Say, I know we've seen overpopulation of pigeons, and some councils literally poison them and trap them. But there are some councils who have tried using fertility control, where they put fertility control, an active ingredient, in their feed, and the pigeons then become infertile. And once you stop feeding them this active ingredient for 2 days, they become fertile again. So it's very reversible. So I guess small scale things like that is where they're more looking, and it's just research at the moment. My question, I suppose, is: do you think that the current state that exists in the wild, the well-being of the sentient beings, do you feel like that is likely to be optimal, the one that's occurred naturally?
Well,
sorry, when I say optimal, I mean optimal for their well-being.
Optimal for their well-being, yeah, because when you just say optimal, then it's we need to be like optimal for what? For optimal for their well-being. Well, um, it well no, but what is optimal for someone's well-being would just be like some sort of artificial state of happiness, like being strapped into the matrix and sort of like having maximal well-being. So that would be optimal for well-being, right? But that's not the state that anyone finds. Even the most wealthy, white, privileged male sitting in their Beverly Hills mansion doesn't experience what would be optimally good for their welfare. So even if you take the most privileged example of a human being, the most privileged example from the most privileged species, then we're still not going to get to optimal. So I don't know if it's an interesting thing to address, because you've got like questions like when you were talking earlier about the movement, like are you talking like humanity plus, like with sort of like people like David Pearce and those sorts of people like trying to artificially boost the well-being of people and animals?
No, not necessarily. I think David Pearce is behind the movement to help wild animals for sure, but I think David Pearce is kind of a bit more out there with his views. Yeah. And very, I suppose you could say progressive, but it's not as if the movement to wild animal suffering are trying to turn predators into herbivores and stuff like that. That's not what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But the reason I asked if you think that the current position is optimal for wild animals is because I understand your concerns that we could make things worse, but if the best available evidence were to suggest that we could in fact make a difference, then I guess I don't see any reason why we wouldn't try to make their lives better, like we do for humans. Sure.
So, as I granted around the time that we had technical difficulties with the sound, I was saying that in terms of like a hypothetical imperative of if our goal is to reduce wild animal suffering, and we do have this strategy in place, then we should do it, then we ought to do it. So I can agree with that. But what I wouldn't agree with is the fact that I have that motive in the first place. So although I can grant that, if that's our motive, I don't hold that motive. And then we would need to have a conversation about how we would get to that motive, how we would arrive at that motive. Yeah. And then that's going to be normative ethics and meta-ethics. And
maybe. I mean, I'll ask you a few questions and see if we can kind of get there or see where it takes us. So, do you think that suffering matters?
Well, again, like matters in what context? Because of course suffering matters if you're looking at context where it matters. But if you're asking me if that is the most important metric to base value in general upon something like this, then no, I don't think it matters as the primary determiner.
Not necessarily the most important thing to you, but would you say that suffering is bad?
No, I would say that suffering is not bad, because there's like, I'll just give you the classic gym analogy or the marathon analogy. Like, when I run a marathon, there will be an element of suffering, especially past for me, the suffering normally kicks in about 30k in a marathon. I'll start to really, I'll be like, why am I doing this? I want to run the marathon, so I'll see the marathon through. But actually, in the moment, I'm experiencing actual suffering. Like, I am actually in pain around like 30k, especially if I don't train that much for a marathon. And so I'll run the additional 12 kilometers, literally suffering. But the activity itself, the entirety of the activity of running a marathon, is absolutely fantastic. And you might think, well, where's, like, what does the dopamine make up for it at the end? No, because the suffering that I experienced for especially those 12 grueling kilometers isn't made up for by the dopamine of finishing the race. Of course not, because it's only a very short, like, oh wow, cool, I've done it, right? But there's some sense of achievement and some sense of ultimate, some higher value which you get from running a marathon, which can't be negated by the bit of suffering. So in that context, that suffering is incredible. That suffering is brilliant. I want that suffering. I want to suffer, because that suffering is the thing that I have to push through to get the result out the other end. So that suffering is amazing, and I wouldn't want to wish that suffering away at all. I want that suffering.
Right. But what you want is the result at the end. Right.
Well, if I could, for example, with the sort of Pierce approach, sort of like wire ahead my so remove the pain from the marathon, then I wouldn't want to run the marathon anymore. It negates the entire reason why I'm running the marathon.
Right.
That suffering is necessary.
So
I need suffering.
The result would be different. The suffering has instrumental value to you in showing that you can overcome challenges.
Yeah, in a roundabout way. Yeah. Sure.
So I think I agree with you there, but that doesn't mean that the suffering has intrinsic value. It doesn't mean that the suffering isn't bad. The suffering itself can be bad, and it can lead to outcomes that you like. So the other example you mentioned was going to the gym, and people say, I go to the gym and I lift all these weights and it hurts and it suffers, but I do it anyway because I like the challenge and it gives me a good physique or makes me more healthy. And so what they're doing is they're getting pleasure out of the outcome, and they're saying it's worth the suffering. But that doesn't mean the suffering is intrinsically bad. It's like when someone goes to the dentist and they say, look, I choose to suffer because I go to the dentist. And it's like, well, what you're doing is you're having an outcome that reduces suffering or increases pleasure, if it's the gym example. It reduces suffering, and the actual pain that you have in the dentist, that isn't good. Just the outcome is good. And you'd rather have that outcome if you could get it without the suffering. Like it would be better if you had the sense of achievement that you get from running a marathon without the suffering. It's just that you probably won't be able to get it. It's because the suffering is instrumentally valuable. But do you agree with me in saying that the suffering, the pain, it isn't intrinsically valuable?
No, I would say that there's two different examples on the table. So the dentist example, of course, I don't want to go to the dentist and suffer through agony to get my teeth fixed. I'd rather just skip the agony part, and take the thing that you inject to make your mouth numb. I actually didn't do that last time, and it was like quite horrible because I didn't want the injection. So I said, okay, no anesthetic. And they like drilled my teeth without anesthetic.
You
and
were
it was,
suffering is good. Don't need the injection.
well, I didn't want to suffer. I was like, can you do it without causing me extreme pain? And it was like, I'll try it,
yeah.
But it didn't really work, and it was very painful. And I sort of regret not getting the injection. So when you go into the, you sort of want the injection to take away the pain because you just want the end result of having teeth that aren't falling out. But with the marathon, it's different because if I removed the suffering as part of the marathon, then I wouldn't do it. It would be like if a lot of people, rock climbers, for example, free rock climbers who don't use ropes, free climbers, if there wasn't an element of you slip, you die, then they wouldn't do it. They want to be able to die. They want the possibility of, if I slip, I will die. I'm going to fall to my death. They want that. And if there wasn't that, then they wouldn't do it. It would be they would play PlayStation, or they would go to the gym, or they would play football. They would find some other thing to do. Or they'll maybe do like bouldering or some other thing. The point of free climbing, the challenge, and with the marathons and with these extreme sports and with anything that you have to endure through the suffering is part of the fun. If you say so yes, we do value this. Like, it is valuable, the suffering. Yeah, it is.
It adds to the satisfaction, but the suffering in itself, by definition, isn't fun. The suffering is unpleasant, but it can add to the satisfaction of overcoming something that's challenging, something that's unpleasant. But surely that means that while we both agree that the suffering can be instrumentally valuable and can actually lead to positive outcomes where people change their lives as a result of going through suffering, this doesn't mean that the suffering itself is good.
Well,
it can be instrumentally good if it leads to a positive outcome, but this doesn't mean that the suffering is intrinsically good, right?
Well, what we're doing is divorcing the sensation from the context by saying this, because if I'm just laying on the sofa and you just inject me with a drug that makes me feel like I am at at kilometer 40 of a marathon, then I'd be like, oh, I don't feel well. What's going on? Oh, my feet hurt. Oh, this isn't nice. I don't like this. Right? If I'm just laying on the sofa. But in the context of running, it is enjoyable. The pain is enjoyable. It's a weird sensation to say. It's a weird sensation and a weird thing to describe. It's not even just like, oh, this is worth it because of the goal. It's like, no, right now, this is fun.
Right. So is it suffering then?
It's pain. So the thing is, what you're going to say is suffering is is bad. It's inextricably linked to a sense of badness, right? Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't bad, if you were enjoying it, then it wouldn't be suffering, because then it would be good. But we have to understand what is suffering, because if suffering is not pain, if suffering is literally just like, if you're defining suffering as something which is undesirable.
No, so I guess to clarify that, I would say it's a difficult question, but I would say suffering is some kind of psychological unpleasantness. I wouldn't merely define it as pain, because someone could have anxiety and suffer from anxiety, and I'd still say they could be suffering. So I'd probably call it some kind of psychological unpleasantness.
Okay, because I would still say that anxiety would be a mental type of pain, because I suffer from anxiety sometimes. And I would describe that as like a mental pain, almost like you, it's almost like an ache. I'd describe it as like an ache in the brain without any sort of pain sensation. It's like a mental ache. I'd describe it as. It sounds weird to say, but so I'd describe that as like a mental pain, which is sort of a bit of a weird thing to say, but yeah, when you're saying that something's undesirable, right, then that means that pain now becomes desirable, and because when I'm running the marathon at kilometer 35 or whatever, the pain that I'm experiencing, because that's not mentally undesirable, because that is desirable in the context of the activity, then the pain becomes good. So I'm now a masochist under your definition.
No, because my definition isn't just something I don't desire. It's some kind of psychological unpleasantness, some kind of discomfort.
Yeah, but because it is a discomfort running a marathon, right? But I want that. It's not undesirable. It's not unpleasant in the context of the experience.
The way you describe it when you're running a marathon, it sounds like you're getting pleasure, not suffering.
Well, it's pain. So then you just have to describe me as a masochist, then, right? But I'm not. I don't just like sit here and slip my wrists or something.
But you're saying that you experience physical pain and it gives you pleasure.
But we then have to also think about what we're saying by pleasure, because in terms of pleasure, if we're going to say that the pleasure is the mental satisfaction of accomplishment, then that is a pleasure. But if we're going to say that it gives me pleasure as in a positive sensation that I'm feeling, then it's not, because I'm feeling pain.
Okay, I think it would be useful, suppose, to go to the context of wild animals, because you said we don't want to divorce the pain or the suffering from the context. So in the situation of non-humans who are suffering in the wild from starvation or predation or disease, I mean, do you think that their suffering is good, or do you think their suffering is most likely bad for them?
Then we're linking suffering to a sense of moral good and moral bad, or some sort of like, what does good and what does bad mean, right? So we're going to link it to morality. We're going to say that it's ethically good or ethically bad if they suffer. Well,
no, I guess right now, I just want to know if you think that you'd rather that the suffering wasn't happening. Do you have a preference for them not to suffer? Do you think it's bad for the individual, and you'd rather that they weren't sort of slowly dying over 8 hours?
Well, now we're sort of presupposing things here, because if for me to say I would rather that not be the case, it means that I think that there's some sort of ethical problem with that happening, or that it's morally wrong for that to happen, and then we're going to need to establish our grounds for saying that is morally wrong or that is morally right, and then we could have a conversation about that. So if you ask me, is it morally wrong or is it bad in some sort of moral way for an animal to suffer in the forest? No, it's not. under my ethics. If I was the animal, would I want to, for example, slowly die of being devoured alive or something? I probably wouldn't want that, right? It's not something that I would necessarily want if I was in that position. But it doesn't then follow that I should say that it's a morally bad thing for animals to have that sensation or be in that position.
So I'm not necessarily talking about morality here. I'm not necessarily asking you whether we should go in and try and stop it, or whether it's wrong if we don't try and stop it. I'm just saying that, like, is their suffering a bad thing? In the same sense, like, if I stub my toe in my house, I'm not going to say it's unethical that I stubbed my toe. But we can still say, oh, it's bad that Jack stubbed his toe. It's bad that he felt that pain or that suffering. So that's what I'm talking about. Not, is it moral? Is it morally acceptable to let it continue? Just, is it bad? It's bad. I'd say it's bad when I stub my toe. Would you agree with me that it's bad when I stub my toe?
What you're saying is it's unpleasant when I stub my toe.
Yes.
Right. It's unpleasant. Yeah.
And
I can agree that.
I'd rather it didn't happen.
Yeah. When I stub my toe, I would agree that it's unpleasant, and I'd rather that it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if I'd rather it didn't happen. That's a separate conversation.
And if I stub my toe, would you say that it's unpleasant and you'd rather it didn't happen?
It's unpleasant for you, yes. But whether that has any sort of link back to whether something is good or bad, we need to understand what is good or bad. Because if you're defining bad as unpleasant, then sure, it's unpleasant. But if you're defining bad, if we're going to equivocate on the meaning of bad to then jump to that is morally bad, or there's some moral implication, or I should be compelled to act in a certain way, or I should feel a certain way towards an animal, then that's a separate thing.
Yeah.
But if we're just going to define bad as unpleasant in that particular context, then sure, it's bad.
I suppose we don't need to jump to whether we should intervene or anything just yet, but I would say it's, from my perspective, the animal who's suffering intensely for long periods of time, I'd say it's bad from the perspective of the individual. It's unpleasant for them, and they would rather be free from it. That's how I'd say.
Sure, it's unpleasant, yeah.
And would you say it's bad from the perspective of the rabbit that they're being eaten alive? It's bad from their perspective.
Sure, it's unpleasant, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. In the same way, you'd say in a human context, you'd say it's not necessarily morally wrong for a child to die of malaria, but you'd say it's bad from their perspective, and it's bad from the perspective of their family.
Sure, that would be unpleasant as well, yeah.
Yeah. And in that context, would you say that we should help these humans suffering from malaria?
No.
So I guess this is a key distinction we made in the videos, and that's the difference between, I suppose, moral virtue and a moral obligation. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So, do you want to kind of outline your thoughts about, say the child with malaria, whether it's an obligation or not, or just a virtue to help them?
Well, the way I see morality is generally from a negative point of view, meaning you shouldn't do these things. Not from a positive point of view, meaning you are compelled to act in a certain way to do these other things over here because you have some sense of moral compulsion. So I'm generally focused on negative moral decisions. So, for example, don't murder someone, don't torture animals, don't lie, don't cheat, don't break laws, don't do things which we could go into the technicalities of that later, but just to keep it super basic and layman for now, just like, don't do things that are bad. So, for example, in the context of veganism, don't pay for animals to be tortured and stabbed, and so that you can eat their carcasses. Just don't do that. It's wrong. Don't do that. But now, when we say, "Oh, look at these people over here, they're suffering," don't you feel moral obligation to help them? No, because I'm not causing that. Right? I could go over there and help them, and that would be a nice thing, maybe. Many people would consider that a nice thing. I would consider it a nice thing if I was walking down the street and I saw someone who was in need and I helped them. That would be a nice thing. But I don't have any moral obligation that I feel to help them. It's only sort of being nice. So I can be nice wherever I want. I can be nice to feed hungry birds. I can be nice to help a squirrel that's in pain in the forest or something like this. But I don't have any moral obligation to do these things.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, just I'm going to kind of try and repeat your position back to you, just so I know I'm fully understanding it. So you don't feel like it's an obligation to help others or wild animals, and am I right in saying the criteria for something being a moral obligation is related to a negative moral decision? So we have an obligation not to inflict suffering, but we haven't got an obligation to prevent suffering or reduce suffering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I think so. I suppose it's an action omission distinction, and I suppose my question then would be, say if we had an example where there was some disease that had a very high probability of causing a large amount of suffering and death, and it could easily be prevented just by the parents making sure that their child has a vaccination. Are parents who decide not to vaccinate their children, are they doing something wrong? Or are you saying that's not an obligation to vaccinate your child, so it's ethical to allow your child to die of this disease when you could easily stop it?
Well, the thing is here is you're now sort of blurring the line slightly, because are we going to say that it constituted an act of negligence, that it was actually them murdering their child at that point? That would be the question there, because if it was like there was a protocol that people vaccinated their child against this particular disease because we knew that it was prevalent, and if you didn't vaccinate this specific thing, then the child is likely to die. If you went to a court and they said, okay, well, why did you not give the vaccination? They'll be like, because we didn't want to. They'll be like, okay, well then you were neglecting, like you literally killed your child then, right? So at that point it was an act of killing in that context, right?
But I suppose it wasn't. It was just an omission. It was just an omission of action. They just didn't act.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's it sort of, in that context, what you're saying is, because of there's a duty that I'll explain a bit more detail, right? So my ethics are very Kantian in the way that I actually sort of like see morality, and so like there's something that I sort of need to put on the table for people to understand. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant, like, he came up with this is the classical translation: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So with that, it means there's two ways that we can look at this. If we say, for example, I think murder is correct, murder is morally okay, or I think lying is moral. Let's take lying, for example. It's very easy to explain. I think lying is morally okay. Then it means that you will think that lying is okay if it was universalized as a law of nature. And then if everyone lied to each other, lying is an act of deliberately trying to deceive someone. Then if everyone tried to deceive everyone, then everyone would know that everyone was trying to deceive someone, and no one would expect the truth. So then you'll annihilate the sense of what a lie is, because no one would be honest anymore. So everyone would expect the dishonesty. So no one would be honest anymore. And then so it annihilates itself. So it couldn't possibly be a universal law. But there's also a sense of want. Would you want to live in this with this rule? So in the case of lying, it wouldn't be possible to live with this rule. But if it was possible to do something, would you want running? Would you want to live in a world where everyone thought that it was okay to run? Of course, because running is okay. So you wouldn't. There's no problem with it annihilating itself from the universalization, and there's no problem with you wanting to live in the world where people run. So this is my duty, right? My moral duty comes from the categorical imperative, which is what I've just explained. So would you want to live in a world where everybody knowingly killed their children through negligence from a vaccination. Well, if everyone knowingly did that, then there would be no more children anymore, and morality would cease to exist because everyone would die. So I have an obligation, morally, to not self-destruct, right? So if we actually look at it through the lens that I view morality, it would be my moral obligation to administer the vaccine, because otherwise it would annihilate myself. So when I'm saying about negative rights, that's the vast majority of the time. Mm-hmm. But when we actually look through the perspective of a deontological perspective, we would still come to the conclusion that you should administer the vaccination, despite the fact it was a bit of a long explanation, and I apologize for being so long, but because it's a nuanced topic. So when I say, my rights are essentially the way I view stuff is essentially just negative, that's just to cut out all of this back explanation that is normally unnecessary. But if you're going to press me on specific scenarios, then I'm going to have to invoke the full system. Otherwise, it's not going to come to the conclusion that we want.
Sure. It seems to me that the reason why you wouldn't want parents to be allowed to allow their children to die from not vaccinating them is your decision is based on the premise that you wouldn't want to live in a world where this happens a lot, right?
You couldn't live in the world where that happened, because if it went on and everyone acted in that way, then there would be no more humans, there would be no more morality in the world. Well, morality would defeat itself.
There's likely to be humans who are immune to some diseases due to their genetics, and some. I mean, we got through the world without vaccinations for a very long time. I wouldn't expect humans to die out if parents stopped vaccinating their children. It would just cause a hell of a lot of suffering and death.
Well, your hypothetical was that the child died, right? So if we universalize the death of the child, that means the entire human race dies. But if we introduce a percentage, we say an 80% percentage that the child dies, then we wouldn't be able to use the first sense of the contradiction of the categorical imperative. We would have to use the second sense of, would you want to live in that world? And most people would say they wouldn't want to live in that world. So if you wouldn't want to live in the world where everyone with an 80% likelihood killed their child through neglect, then it would be a moral wrong for you to do it yourself.
Yeah. So it's I guess it's kind of like a heuristic you follow, that you care about negative rights and encouraging people not to do certain things, but there are specific scenarios where you believe we do have an obligation to act, like in this situation where a parent is obliged to vaccinate their child.
Sure. In that case, it's virtuous, right? So you can sort of like simplify the categorical imperative into moral duty and then some sort of moral virtue. Because the thing is, like, before... So, like, virtue ethics is very old. It can go back to Aristotle was like a virtue ethicist. But like the sort of modern revival of virtue ethics was much later than when like Kant was writing about the categorical imperative in like I think it was 17 in the 1780s. Or something. It was a long time ago. So a lot of the language that he used back then, you sort of need to update in the modern context. So the way I'd update it would be to say that it's absolutely wrong for me to murder, to do these things, to like rob things, to like burgle and stuff like that. These are absolutely wrong things. But in terms of like the vaccination, that would be an extremely strong moral virtue.
So, okay, this is an interesting distinction then, because I thought you were suggesting that you think it is morally wrong for parents to allow their child to die because you wouldn't want to live in a world where that's the norm. But you're...
Well, with the 100% one, if you're saying that if you don't vaccinate your child, it will die, with 100% certainty, right? Because I thought that was the original thought experiment.
This specific
Then,
child, yeah. I mean, I don't
yeah,
want to generalize
then
that.
we would
Sorry.
then we would universalize that, and we would see that it would defeat itself. So then it would be an absolute moral wrong to do that.
Right.
But if you introduce some percentage of it's just very likely to die, but it might not, then it won't self-defeat by annihilating the whole human race.
Yeah.
But it would just be a very strong virtue, right? So there's two ways that we could look at it depending on your hypothetical.
Sure. So what I said in the hypothetical was that there was a high probability that the child will die of the disease. So let's call it, I mean, I'm picking these numbers out of thin air, but let's call it 80% chance the child dies if they don't get vaccinated.
Yeah.
You would, on your position, you would say that it's morally acceptable. It's not morally wrong. It's morally acceptable to take that risk when you could get a free vaccination for your child.
Yeah, so I would say if there was an 80% probability that the child would die, you could look at it like it's weird in this context because this is such a grey area, with such a borderline thing. But I would be committed to say that would not be an absolute moral wrong, but it would be morally unvirtuous, right? It would be morally unvirtuous to the point where it would be, in the Kantian system, it would be morally wrong, but it would not be an absolute moral wrong. It would still be morally wrong, though, right?
Sorry.
Yeah, because of like the second way that you look at the categorical imperative.
Because it's not a world that you would want to live in.
Essentially, yeah. Like it's stronger than that. It's not just like a world that you want to live in. If it was universalized, so everybody did this, would that somehow be so objectionable that you could not tolerate this world, right? Then, if you answer yes to that, so we have to invoke some sort of descriptivism here at some point as well, because someone might be like, yeah, that's cool. And if you say, yeah, that's cool, then it's not morally wrong. For anyone who says, no, that is wrong, then it is morally wrong, right? But where this is such a borderline case of, in a court, if that went to court and the judge said, well, you murdered the child then, they wouldn't say, oh, well, that might have been a moral wrong, but it would have been really virtuous if you did give the vaccination, but actually it wasn't a moral wrong or something like this. The judge wouldn't say that. The judge would say that you murdered the child. So or
manslaughter, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'm just so from your perspective, you would say would you say that the parents are doing something wrong by doing that, and we should encourage them not to? They're doing something wrong.
Yeah. So under Kantian ethics, that would be like a weak moral wrong. Yeah.
And that's the ethics that you prescribe to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I suppose I would say if we can say that would be morally wrong, we could also say that also allowing a child to die of malaria when we could easily administer a malaria net, and say if they don't have the malaria net, they have the 80% chance of death. Surely we'd say that for the exact same reasons, you'd say that's morally wrong as well. To allow.
Or is it my child?
No, but neither was the other hypothetical. It was some other parents that did this.
Oh, I thought I was the parent of the child, so I had to, like, what? I'm an observer looking at another family, pointing the finger, saying that I was morally wrong.
Yeah, I'm asking you if you feel like the parents did something morally wrong.
Yeah, well, we're talking about a family relationship, but if you move outside of the family relationship, and we're talking about some random person now, and whether I would be doing a moral wrong for this person on the other side of the world to die of malaria when I could have donated 1 cent and saved the malaria death, then I would say that it wasn't a moral wrong, because the reason why it was a weak moral wrong with the parent killing the child for not administering the vaccination with an 80% chance of them dying is because it was their child, right? But this is why you're sort of like pressing me on the finer points, and I'm really interested and happy to talk about these points. But when you're talking on sort of like grey area points and like very borderline points, there's more nuance that needs to be taken into consideration. Because, for example, the family relationship matters, because you're a consequentialist, right? So if we say that we do a trolley problem and we say there's 2 people on one track and there's 3 people on another track, and the train's headed for the 3 people, then you'd pull the lever as a consequentialist, or as a utilitarian. You'd pull the lever to make the train go and kill the 2 people, right? Most people would. Most utilitarians would, because otherwise you're just in contradiction of your own moral system. But if we put your mum and dad on the track where it's the 2 people, and you have to pull the lever to kill your own mum and dad so that you can save, quote unquote, save a life in that situation, you're not going to do that.
Well,
I'm assuming, right?
Well, I think there's like a big difference between what I should do and what I would do. And I think in the case of my parents, I feel like there's psychological baggage there that's going to distort me and perhaps make me do something that isn't the right thing. And I suppose what we're trying to figure out together is what is the best course of action, and whether they're my family or not. I would say to you now, the right thing for me to do would be to choose the outcome that saves the most lives.
Yeah, sure. So your moral system obligates you to kill your parents, but you wouldn't anyway. You would go against your moral system, whereas my moral system would not obligate me to do that, but I might do it anyway as well, right? Because moral systems break down in that regard. But this is the thing: when you apply the categorical imperative to things, and it's not a contradiction when universalized, and it's only a world that you wouldn't want to live in, then it depends on the person whether they would want to live in that world or not, right? So if you'd want to live in the world where you didn't donate money to malaria charities, then it's not morally wrong to not donate money to malaria charities. But for you, maybe if you don't want to live in that world, if you wish that everyone would donate to malaria charities, then it's morally wrong for you to donate. So that's why it's weak. It can't be, the categorical imperative can't really say it's an absolute moral wrong or it's an absolute moral right, because then it's based upon some sort of like value at that point. And that's why it's so borderline, because most of the time the categorical imperative can tell us an absolute right or wrong for real sort of like the essence of a moral action. But when you're going to invoke these very specific cases of donating to charity with malaria nets for people the other side of the world, then it's just going to come out that it's not a moral obligation for me, but it might be a moral obligation for you.
But you feel like it is an obligation. You don't want to live in a world where 80% of children die of malaria, and you feel it is morally wrong to allow children to die of malaria, right?
It is a slight subtlety there. I wouldn't want to live in the world where 80% of the time people killed their own children.
Well, just didn't save them.
Yeah, or didn't admit it, because I'm actually unsure whether that's killing or saving.
Okay, but either way, you wouldn't want to, regardless of what we call it with the semantics, you wouldn't want to live in that world, and therefore you would say you said something like a weak moral wrong.
Yeah, it would be like, you would see it as morally virtuous, but you would see it as a weak moral wrong to not do that, because an absolute moral wrong is, if we universalize this principle, it's going to contradict itself. Sure. And it couldn't possibly be universal law. But we've just seen that that's not the case, because if you universalized letting your child die of this lack of vaccination disease, mm-hmm. it wouldn't end up in everyone dying.
Yeah.
Immediately.
But you still think it's a moral issue that 80% of people die, and there's something distinct from this universal law that determines what's right and wrong for you. I mean, we could have women being abused like on a mass scale, and that wouldn't lead to humanity to end necessarily. So there's certainly something else that you're in the real world that you're using to determine what's right and wrong, other than this universal law, and that kind of shows in the way that you do feel it's wrong to not vaccinate children if there's an 80% chance they'll die. But then moving to the malaria situation, surely you also feel it's wrong to allow all of these children to suffer and die from malaria for the exact same reasons.
No, because the only reason why the only reason why I thought that it would probably be a weak moral wrong would be because it was your own family. But when it's like other people across the other side of the world, there's been a lot written about this, a lot written about sort of like the disconnection. Like, for example, you give more money the less people you're donating to. So if you give money to save one person, your contribution will be larger than if they're asking money to save 1,000 people. There's a lot of research upon this, and it's just human nature. It's like the inverse of what we would logically consider the right thing to do, right? Sam Harris has talked about this at length. And it seems that if there was 2 people that needed saving, you'd need to donate double the amount of money. But we tend to donate less money for 2 people than 1 person. And we would, like, for example, if my family member was in Australia and said, "Look, I need your help," I would get a taxi to the airport at whatever cost it cost, get on the first plane and go there, whether it cost £10,000 or not. I'm going to Australia and I'm helping my mother or my family member. But if there was some random person in Australia who got my email address and said, "Look, I need your help," I'd be like, "Well, ask someone else. I don't care." And that's what most people would do. Most people wouldn't jump on a plane at the cost of £10,000 and fly across the world to save someone who they don't know. It's not the way it works, but you do it for your own mother.
Right, and I think that kind of highlights how, especially your example that people generally give less when there's more people they're raising money for. We give more for one individual than we do for 10,000, which it's just so makes no sense at all, and it kind of shows how flawed we are as human beings. And I think it suggests that we need to acknowledge that our intuitions are very often wrong. And I think one of the ways we can kind of overcome some of these biases is to acknowledge that every individual matters. Every individual has equal consideration, regardless of where they are in the world, and regardless of whether they're part of your kin. So a child who's in your family and a child who's in someone else's family, them dying from malaria or a lack of a vaccination saving them from a disease, that's equally as bad if the suffering is equalised.
I just don't agree. Yeah, this is where we diverge. If you do genuinely hold that view, then that means that the implications would be quite severe for you. For example, you should spend as much time with other random people you see on the street as you do with your parents. Like, you should treat your parents the same way as you. That's what your view sort of commits you to.
No,
like, you should.
I'm talking about equal consideration, not equal treatment. So, if I don't need to start going for dinners with someone else's mum. I just think that they deserve equal consideration in relation to their suffering. And I'm not saying that I'm living the perfect life in terms of the way things should be, because I have all of these biases, and I'm an imperfect human being who makes the same mistakes other people do when we give more money to one individual than 1,000. But surely we can both agree that all individuals deserve equal consideration. Like, your suffering matters just as much as my suffering, as much as a pig's suffering.
Sure. I think if you are looking at suffering and the suffering appears to be equal between these people, then it's just tautological to say that they have equal suffering. But that doesn't mean that we should treat them in the same way. So just because their suffering is equal, that means their suffering is equal. That doesn't mean that we should act upon that information. That's just a tautology, right? Like, do you know what I mean?
Well, if you're coming from the premise that suffering is bad, which I believe it is because it's bad for the individual who's experiencing it, and I'm choosing between, and I have a worldview where I want to reduce suffering and help others out of their suffering. It just means that whether if a pig is getting stabbed and a human is getting stabbed and the exact same amount of suffering is being caused, I should care equally, and I shouldn't be swayed towards the human or my family member just because they're my family member.
Sure, but there's two things there. Firstly, you're presupposing a worldview where you care most about preventing suffering, and secondly, you're committing yourself to, let's say someone was beating up your mum, like you were walking down the street with your mother, and someone came up to your mother and started punching her, but you saw at the other side of the street there was someone who something worse was going on with them, slightly worse than getting beaten up. Maybe they were getting beaten up harder. Maybe there was a woman beating up your mum, but at the other side of the road there was a woman getting beaten up by a man, and because the man was stronger, the blows were harder. So you'd be committed under this sort of worldview to go to the other side, just leave your mum who's getting beaten up and go to the other side of the road and help this random individual. That would be, you'd be committed to all sorts of weird things if you actually held that view.
If in this scenario you're saying that the suffering of the other person is significantly greater and I have to choose between ending one or the other, then I believe the right thing to do would be to save the person who's not my relative, because they have equal consideration. There's no reason that my mum matters more than someone else's mum. But like, we have to acknowledge that we're just evolved apes over thousands and thousands of years, and we have all of these biases, all these psychological biases, and you know, because someone's has more of my genes, I'm kind of biased towards them from an evolutionary perspective. But there's a key distinction between how I would act as a person and how I do immoral things, like perhaps favouring my mum over someone else's mum, and how I think society should be structured, and what I think the right thing to do is, while acknowledging that I'm imperfect.
Yeah, sure. That applies to my moral framework to a similar extent as well. But what I'm trying to highlight here is my moral framework doesn't commit me to bizarre scenarios where I would be committed to say that it's morally that something was morally correct despite me not thinking it. Like, for example, we could just highlight this even more very easily to show how bizarre your commitments would have to be under this view. So if we take, for example, we get Harvey Weinstein, and we get him out of prison, and we bring him over to the UK and get him to date rape your entire family, and then because your entire family were date raped with the drug, they won't remember anything, and they'll wake up and they'll just feel fine. There was no suffering involved, but Harvey got like an immense satisfaction out of date raping your entire family. Then you're committed under your moral framework to say it was morally correct, it was a morally good thing, it was a great thing, and you would say that it should happen again under your moral system, that your entire family were raped. But you obviously wouldn't think that. That's just not in line with your views.
Well, just to be clear, I probably am leaning towards more being a negative utilitarian with my normative ethics rather than a classical. I don't think there's an obligation to create pleasure. So that's the first thing. But yeah, I mean, the reductio of, because I care about the consequences, and you're saying, okay, someone's going to come and date rape your family, and I'm assuming you're saying that I'll never know about this.
Yeah, you won't know about it.
Yeah, and neither did my family.
No one finds out about it. So then it would be a great thing that should happen again, according to your
not necessarily
moral good.
Because, as I said, I don't feel an urge or an obligation to increase pleasure in the world. I feel an obligation to reduce suffering. But this is like a really difficult philosophical question, where you say something is, because I mean, I agree with you. I have the intuition that something like that is morally wrong. I have that intuition, but you're telling me that there's literally no consequences. There's no suffering. It doesn't change my family's life at all. Nothing changes. So I agree. I mean, I agree with you. My intuition is that it's wrong, because if I knew about it, I would care. But in your scenario, I'd never know about it. No one would know about it apart from the person doing it. So, yeah, I see what you're saying. But again, I'm not sure how to answer that. It's a really difficult reductio. I mean, we can we can say the same thing on your position to bring reductios as well, though. I mean, I know I've given you this one before, but I told you that let's say there's an individual who's going to experience eternal suffering in hell forever, and all you have to do to stop it is to blink. Now, your position commits you to saying that you're not obligated to blink. It's morally acceptable in that it's not immoral. It's morally acceptable to keep your eyes open and allow that suffering to go on for eternity. That seems extremely counterintuitive to me.
Well, again, if I was going to take a Kantian stance, what I'd say is it's not an absolute moral to not blink, because you can't, because there's no, like, let's think about this. If everyone, if it was a universal law that if no one blinked, then everyone would be in eternal pain, then it wouldn't somehow defeat itself. No, so it's not an absolute wrong. But if I asked, would you want that to be a rule that everyone could does not blink and be in eternal agony, then I wouldn't want to live in that world. So it would be like a non-absolute moral wrong.
And why would you not want to be in that world?
Because I wouldn't want to be the recipient of that suffering, right?
Right. So you think that suffering is bad?
I think it's undesirable. If we're gonna say bad is undesirable, yeah, it's undesirable for me to suffer in that way. Not in all ways. Suffering isn't always bad, but suffering in that way is would be bad. Yeah, something that I wouldn't want. It would be against my desire.
I'd say it's intrinsically bad, and it can be instrumentally good in the case of lifting weights or running a marathon.
Yeah, I still sort of think that I disagree slightly there, and I think we've discussed that already. Maybe people watching can make up their mind.
Yeah.
I'd say in terms of the negative utilitarian stuff, I find that even more problematic than if you're going to say that pleasure doesn't count for anything. I find that very problematic. And if you're saying that there's an asymmetry, you're saying that there's an asymmetry.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say that I disvalue suffering more than I value pleasure. But I don't really want to get into to end this discussion with a normative ethics debate about negative utilitarianism or deontology. I'd kind of rather, because we did do a lot of that in the videos. I'd kind of rather finish up with us talking about the real world of what's happening to wild animals.
Sure.
I'm wondering if there's places we can agree on. So, I mean, would you say we both care about the suffering of all animals, or would you say that you don't care about animal suffering, you just care about animal rights?
Well, I don't even care about other humans suffering.
But you do care about your own suffering, because you wouldn't want to go to hell.
Yeah, I'm an egoist in that sense, right? But I care about my family's suffering more than I care about some other person on the other side of the world. So.
But do you think there's a rational
I think
reason?
There's more of a conversation.
Do you think there's a rational?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you think there is? To say that your family's suffering matters more than someone else's family suffering.
Yeah, because families, the whole point of a family is to help itself out and act as some sort of support unit of in life, and we can contrast that with it. It's the strategy, the biological strategy, so to say, of reproduction. Because if we take, for example, mosquitoes just fart out 1 million mosquito eggs and then just move on, and the ones that live, and the ones that get eaten by fish die, and who cares? Just there's 1 million eggs, whatever. And then all those mosquitoes will just become mosquitoes and just fly about and do their thing, and they won't care who their mum is, and they won't care about the family. There's no sense of family with a mosquito. Family doesn't make any sense with mosquitoes. But where the death of a child for a human being is such a tragic thing. That's where family comes from. Just in terms of evolution and nature, family is this very tight, small group of humans who help each other go through the world, and that's why family is so important. So if we were mosquitoes, then I would care about my mum the same I'd care about some other mosquito, which is to say not at all, or very little.
Yeah.
But as we are humans, it's not only just our sort of cultural convention, it's literally what we are as human beings which defines this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand that due to the way we evolved with natural and sexual selection, we favour our own offspring more than we favour someone else's offspring. But do you think that because that's the way we evolved, do you think that's necessarily what's right to favour our offspring over someone else's offspring? Is that the best moral? Is that the best we can achieve morally?
Well, it's an interesting question because, like, if you said this question in different contexts, it's saying like I know that we evolved to breathe oxygen and to consume carbohydrates and stuff like this, but actually, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to respire, and then we could swim underwater and we could go to the moon without having to have supplementary oxygen? Well, of course that would be pretty cool, but that's not what we are as humans. As human beings, this is what we are, and we can't transcend what we are, because then that's not only is it impossible, but it doesn't make sense as well, because to transcend what you are means that you could sort of, it's just contradictory, because it's like to say it's like cognitive relativism. So if we looked at a lion, if a lion could talk English, we wouldn't be able to understand what the lion was saying, because for it to be what how a lion is, what it is to a lion to be a lion is something altogether different to what it is to be a human. So to say if it was otherwise, well, then we wouldn't be human. We would be transcending our humanity, which doesn't make sense to me. It's impossible and doesn't make sense.
So, I suppose what really at a biological level, what distinguishes, say, a family member to a non-family member is the genetic similarities. So I share more of my genes with my mum on average than I do with, say, your mum. But I suppose we can kind of extrapolate that and look at different races and different groups, and we can say, well, look, tribal violence has been common throughout history. Our hunter-gatherers, it's likely that they had tribal wars with other groups. I guess if we're going to say that this person is more similar to me in their genetic makeup and therefore they matter more morally, I mean, wouldn't that justify racism and sexism?
Well, you can have family comprised of white parents and a black child, right? And then they can love the child just as much as they love the white child. It doesn't matter the race or the genetic similarity of the child. It matters the family unit, the way that we've evolved as humans to see families and experience a family structure.
I understand that there's like social effects, but from an evolutionary level, the very reason that we care more about our family is because we've evolved to feel that way, because it spreads our genes into the next gene pool. So I guess I'm not seeing a distinction between that and then further groups who are more similar to me genetically.
Well, what you've said, if I've understood your objection, is that evolutionarily speaking, the reason we do value family is because of genetics and gene propagation. But yes, maybe that was the reason. But what I'm saying is we do, as humans, have these family structures, and it is what it means to be a human, in a sense, to have these family structures. Because, for example, if I just decided to go in the woods and live on my own and never speak to my family again, that would have it would cause me psychological damage or distress. I would injure myself psychologically to do that, to live alone and become a hermit in the forest. That will cause me it would literally wreck my what it means to be me, right? And so for me to do that, not only am I'm going against what I am as a person. So it doesn't matter how we arrived at that. What it matters is that I am that, right? That we are humans. It doesn't matter how we got here. But to say that, oh, just because we got here through evolution, oh, that doesn't matter. Well, no, of course it matters, because that's what we are as humans.
So I completely acknowledge that we are biased towards our kin, that we do have all of these psychological biases, even towards our own race, which is research for. But what I'm saying is, while I can acknowledge that is true, that's what we are, we're such imperfect apes that we have all these biases, I'm saying that we should use rationality to think about how, if I suffer and that matters to me, then someone else's suffering probably matters to them, and that there's no reason to prefer to help me over them. That we all deserve equal consideration for our suffering. So I acknowledge that we've evolved a certain way, but surely when we're talking about morality, we should be thinking about getting past our evolutionary past and our cultural past, and just work towards making the world a better place for all of us.
That could be something you'd want to do, and many people might agree that it's nice. But the problem with that is, I'm tempted to say that it's a doxastic necessity in terms of alethic modal necessity, but that's a bit of a mouthful. What I mean to say by this is that because you think that would be morally virtuous and good, and that you can, with your axioms, you can arrive at this conclusion, that doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion is arrived at independent from the way that you see the world. So, because you might ask me, Footsoldier, how do you see the world? And wouldn't you think that this is a better place to live in? And I'd be like, no, I don't agree. So, although it seems like it logically follows from your axioms, this conclusion, it doesn't logically follow from my axioms. And so, it's like, if we were to, like, for example, in the world where everyone was just going around and like being friendly to each other and sharing everything, and some sort of like ultra communist utopia, some people would really love that, but I don't like that idea. For me, that sounds somehow dystopian and repulsive, because like there's various reasons why I would oppose that, and many other people would oppose that, especially people who come from a background of libertarianism or capitalism and these sorts of things. They would oppose that strongly. But people who come from a Marxist background, or people who come from like a loving sort of community background, open community background, might really favor that. So I don't think it doesn't follow as strongly in the way that you might think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not claiming that there is some kind of objective morality that I'm finding out. I understand that it essentially boils down to a premise that I have, that suffering is bad, because I think it's bad for the individual, and then from there on I kind of reason that, well, if my suffering is bad, then someone else's suffering is bad for them, and I can't see any meaningful reason to favour one person over another if the suffering is the same. But surely you can agree with me that, I mean, would you prefer there to be less suffering in the world?
I don't know, not really. Like that's not something that I'd primarily value.
Would you rather there was more suffering in the world?
No, it's just not something that I primarily sort of like value or think about. It's like, would you rather that there's more Game Boys in the world, or
Game Boys?
I don't know, maybe.
I mean, would you...
It's like any other thing. Would you rather there was more jelly beans in the world, or more pad thai in the world? I don't know. Like, do you know what I mean? But I know it's stronger than that. You were saying like suffering is this thing that matters to everyone, but or like we could say, would you prefer that people had an 11th toe, or that matters to all humans, or would you prefer that everyone could watch, press a button and watch another show on the TV? There's many things that we could prefer or think, but I don't think that everyone has to agree that it would be a better world to live in if there was less suffering. Because if you think about the logical consequence of removing suffering, let's say we arrived at this like sort of Pearson utopia where everyone has like designer drugs and like the wires in their head where they don't experience any pain, and that they never have any guilt, and they just go through the world in a state of bliss. Well, that would be a terrible world for me to live in. I would despise that world. It would be like the most dystopian future
But by
possible.
definition, you wouldn't, because you said everyone is experiencing bliss. So you can feel that way now, but when you're in that moment, you would be in pure bliss. You wouldn't dislike it by definition.
Well, what would happen is, well, if we're gonna say, maybe I was not careful with my language there, because if we were going to say that people were actually in a state of bliss, that means that they were in a state of bliss. Obviously, that's What I meant by this is we have the designer drugs to boost the serotonin and the dopamine and all the chemicals in the brain, so everyone is sort of like mentally like firing in this sort of like state of quote unquote happiness. But what that would do is it would have this weird dissonance of this permanent, because imagine like imagine a magnet. You've got the North Pole and the South Pole. What happens if you break the magnet in half? Then you get two magnets with two North Poles and two South Poles again. You've just created two magnets. You can't break off the North Pole. You can't break off the South Pole, because a new pole will form. Because they're opposites. Pleasure and pain are opposites. And if you don't have pain, you can't have pleasure, because it doesn't make sense. Because it's pain and pleasure is the interaction between the two. It's like a magnet is only a magnet because of the interaction between the North and the South Pole. If you only had one pole of a magnet, it wouldn't be a magnet. It would just be a rock, because it wouldn't be magnetized. It would have no magnetism.
I suppose I disagree with you on this. I don't agree with the statement, if you can't have pain, you can't have pleasure. I don't see why there's any theoretical reason to believe that's true. And if we switch it the other way around, let's say we've got there are people in the world right now who have just got severe depression, where if you ask them to describe pleasure, they literally cannot describe it. They have no concept of what pleasure is. Their life is just badness to them. It's just suffering. And no, we're not going to say to them, oh, you can't have pain, you can't have suffering because you haven't got pleasure. No, we'd say they're suffering. Like, they still have suffering without the pleasure. So I don't see why we'd say you can't have pain without pleasure. I don't see why we can't envisage a world one day, like David Pearce would probably say, that is just bliss and no suffering. And if that's possible, then that's certainly something I think would be great. But that's kind of taking this like very far. I mean, you don't make these kind of arguments against people trying to reduce human suffering, do you? You don't say that, oh, you're trying to help children dying of parasitic worms. Oh, we do realise there's if you imagine like a magnet, if you cut off that suffering, it's going to be replaced by more suffering, so you should just let them suffer of parasitic worms. It's like, no, we've changed the world around us in several ways that means that people suffer less than they used to in some ways. Like, we've given people drugs that are now widely available that reduce suffering. Like you said before, we've given foxes vaccinations against rabies, and that's reduced their suffering. And we've done things in the past that's reduced suffering, and it hasn't necessarily been replaced with more suffering.
Sure. I would like to mention quickly that I didn't mean that reducing parasitic worm infection rates would somehow delete the concept of pleasure or something like this. That's not what I was saying. So I was saying, if you tried to delete entirely the concept of pain, it would be a futile exercise, because pain and pleasure are sort of like two different sides of the same coin, so to say. But with parasitic worms, that's just like making someone not suffer more or something like that, right? But you'll find that what happens is people adjust to new normals, right? So if you're living in poverty and you've got arthritis or something, then your normal daily reality is normal to you. But then if you win the lottery and buy a drug which cures your arthritis, then you've upgraded your well-being dramatically. But what happens is, after the novelty is worn off, that state of happiness will go back to being normality. And then once they've spent all the money they've got from the lottery, and they can't pay for this arthritis drug anymore, and they get their arthritis back, and then they have to go back and live in the same council flat as they lived before, then the transient response of that would be to be suffering. But then it would, after the novelty of that shock has worn off, it will go back to being the new normal. So this is what we get. We get a new normal arise. So this is why you can't eradicate one of the poles of the magnet, and you can't eradicate pain and suffering entirely. You can reduce suffering, but then you just get a new normal. And so you can sort of, do you see where I'm going here? Like, but you can't eradicate.
It sounds like you're saying that an individual's well-being is fixed, and it's going to stay fixed regardless of what happens to them. But by that reasoning, then why would we ever try to create a better world for people? Why not just torture people because their well-being is set in stone, and it will sort of come to this normal level regardless of what happens in their life? Like, no, we know that if someone is castrated, they're more likely to suffer from depression. We know that people's mood and well-being can change depending on what happens to them in their life, and that we can literally give people medication that improves their well-being, or some kind of social intervention that improves their well-being. And to go back to the other point, I kind of don't see any reason to believe that we can't have pleasure without pain. I know there's been moments in my life where I've had pleasure without pain. I've had multiple operations, and I've been given drugs that make me feel high and not one tiny amount of pain whatsoever. And if I can have it in one moment, I guess I don't see there's any good reason to believe that it's impossible to have that throughout someone's lifespan. But again, I feel like we're kind of drifting off to like these very abstract ideas. And I know, I guess we've been talking for an hour and a half now. I'd probably quite like to wrap it up. But with the wild animal suffering thing, I suppose I'd like to see if we can agree somewhere. And I know you've said in the past that it's not an obligation. It would be, I think you've said it, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've said it would be a good thing to do. It would be a virtuous thing to do to help them if we can. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it depends on exactly what it is.
So let's not get into specifics about the actual intervention. Yeah. Let's just say that there is evidence, because I haven't got any interventions that have been designed specifically for wild animals. So for the well-being of wild animals. So let's just imagine there is evidence that shows we could, in all likelihood, make a significant difference to the lives of wild animals, and it's reversible. So we can reverse it if something goes wrong, and there's there's people working on this to make sure the risks are mitigated as much as possible. Would you be behind that project?
By behind, you mean would I give that project money?
Not necessarily, no. But would you be happy that project exists?
If it, well, if I don't see it as a moral wrong or something, then it's fine. Like, you can do it all you want. Like, for example, if you want to build a statue in your garden, then you can do that. Like, I don't.
Yeah, I suppose
it's not any of my concern.
I mean, do you think it's of concern to the beings who are suffering intensely right now?
Well, obviously, because you're directly intervening in their life, then it's gonna concern them. It's gonna affect them. But whether you're asking me if there's any like moral judgment I can make about that, well, I can say if you're not committing a moral wrong, then it's not wrong. But for example, with veganism, it's like people are committing moral wrongs by enslaving, torturing, and murdering and eating animals. That's a moral wrong, and I can say, look, this is wrong, and like, can't you see this is wrong? I can say, look, this is a moral wrong what you're doing. Like, if someone was murdering someone or doing something horrible, I'd say, look, this is morally wrong. Like, what are you doing? But going into the forest and intervening in the wild, it's not like I would say, no, stop, it's morally wrong. But I also wouldn't say, I wouldn't like throw money at the project and be like, yes, like this is a moral obligation. Like, I'd say, okay, if you want to do that, then that's cool. Yeah. Like, in the same way that if you wanted to like do some awesome art project that that you got like 500 people playing cellos and wanted to make some amazing art project or something with paintings and stuff like that, I would be like, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. but it wouldn't be like, yeah, it's a moral obligation, or that it's morally right or wrong, or there's nothing moral about it. It's just like, yeah, that sounds pretty cool.
I mean, I think
there's
yeah.
I don't know.
I think the key.
Go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I think the key distinction between your perspective and my perspective is that what matters to me is simply the suffering and the death of the individual. I'm not concerned with the cause of the suffering and death. So if we've got two beings who are suffering equally, one of the suffering is occurring naturally, and one of them is suffering caused by a human, or perhaps the first one is suffering caused by a lion. Like, I'd say the suffering of these individuals, and you could say the injustice of their death, if you think that is an injustice, then I'd say they matter equally. I'm not concerned with the cause of the suffering, because what matters to the individuals is the suffering and the death, and I guess that's where we differ.
Yeah, well, of course, what matters to the individual is the suffering and their death. But for example, if I was to go on a very dangerous adventure, and there was a possibility that I could die, would you try and prevent my adventure?
No, because I think that the preferences of individuals is vitally important when we're considering how to create the best possible world. And if I was to prevent you doing something like that, then it would negatively affect your well-being. However, if you do have an accident, I absolutely want to send people out to help you if we easily can, to help you recover from your suffering. If you break your leg or something, I want that measure to be in place.
Okay.
Yeah, so I do care about preferences, I suppose you could say, instrumentally, because it affects well-being.
Sure. Okay. Well, we could continue that and expand the hypothetical and stuff about, like, what if I didn't, what if that was part of the adventure, that there was not the possibility of being saved, like free climbing, stuff like that. But I don't think we need to go into these issues that much. I think what we're trying to get out of this conversation is whether it's a good thing to intervene in nature. And I think what we've got from the conversation so far is we don't know epistemically whether anything we do could be a good thing or not. But if you could try something that could possibly be a good thing and was reversible, and was like, oh, well, should we give it a shot? Or if that is something you're passionate about, then go for it, man. Like, you got every reason to go for it. But I don't personally see why I have to be concerned about that. The same way that I don't seem to have any real concern if there was like some conflict in Afghanistan of like two religious sects blowing each other up. Okay, that doesn't sound nice, but what am I going to do? I'm not involved in that.
So I got sorry, carry on. You can carry on. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay,
man,
I was just going to kind of give you another hypothetical to kind of test that. So if the animal holocaust wasn't being caused by humans but was actually occurring naturally, in my original video on the topic I described it as a slaughterhouse growing like a mushroom out of the ground in the forest. Like, if the Holocaust, everything that's happening to animals right now, was occurring naturally, I mean, would you not care about it anymore?
It is happening naturally, right? That's your entire thesis. It is happening naturally already, on a larger scale than the animal holocaust.
Sure, but not, I guess, not the same. But to answer my question, if everything you care about now with veganism, with the animal holocaust, if the beings that you care about were going through exactly the same thing that they're going through now, but it occurred naturally, would you still care, or would you stop caring?
If it occurred naturally in terms of it was just like how it is now, how it is now in nature, then no, I wouldn't be against it, because I'm not against it now. Because the reason why I'm against not being vegan is because there seems to be a huge moral atrocity happening, that we're perpetuating a moral atrocity, and so I'm against moral atrocity, right? But if for example, I inflict less suffering on a pig by buying it in a pack of bacon at the supermarket, than a pig dying in nature, like a wild boar dying in nature, then I would say that I don't care about the wild boar dying in nature, but I care about what's wrong about me going into the supermarket and paying for that product, which is a moral wrong, because I care about it being a moral wrong. I don't care about the wild boar dying in nature because that's nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
Like, just the same way I don't care about people in Afghanistan blowing each other up. That has nothing to do with me. That's not my moral wrong that I'm committing. I'm not committing any moral wrong. That's some other people doing some shit in some other country that I am not involved in.
Sure. I guess I just can't see any reason why, you've kind of devoted large parts of your life to trying to promote veganism and help these animals who are suffering. I just can't see any reason why, if the exact same thing was happening to these beings, but it was occurring naturally, or even like on a different planet, I just can't see why all of a sudden they're suffering and these beings just wouldn't matter to you morally anymore. And to be honest, I guess I kind of find it hard to believe you when you suggest that you wouldn't care if the Holocaust today suddenly became like a natural occurrence and it was just happening in somewhere else. Like, I feel like maybe you're saying this to try and stay consistent with your normative ethics or your ideology or something like that.
I'll try and explain it in a different way. And I don't know how much of a grotesque thought experiment I want to conjure up on the spot. Let's say, okay, I'll try and go for the less grotesque version. Let's say you had, an infection in your leg, and you went to the hospital and they said, look, unfortunately you've got gangrene in your leg. We're going to have to chop off your leg below the knee, or the bottom half of your leg. It would suck. It would be really bad to have your leg chopped off. That would be a really bad thing. But surely that is different than someone coming up to you with a machete and chopping off your leg in the street. There must be for you some difference between having your leg chopped off by the surgeon and having your leg chopped off by the random terrorist with a machete in the street.
Yeah.
There's some difference between those two acts. And for me, the difference is, yeah, one's morally wrong and the other isn't, but the consequence is exactly the same.
No,
so
the consequences are different. Because if you think about the psychological effects of being attacked rather than having an operation, like having an operation with a doctor, it can affect the way you rationalize the pain and psychologically deal with the pain. Whereas if you get your leg taken off by someone with a machete, which won't be under anesthetic, and I agree with you that intuitively it seems worse, but psychologically it's worse. Because someone's coming over and doing that to you. You can't rationalize that. You can't. There's different psychological effects in play when you talk about someone attacking you in the street compared to when you consent to a procedure to save your leg or something. But
sure, but that's exactly the difference I'm getting at, right? So you're saying that the consequences are different, because the action itself is different.
No, because sorry to interrupt, but the psychological effects are different. So the
psychological effects are different. The psychological effects are different because the consequence, because the action, the way the action was committed, in both cases, your leg's getting chopped off. Let's even normalize it, because you get an infection. You're in the jungle and you get an infection in your leg, and then the surgeon is with you, but they don't have any anesthetic because you're in the jungle. And so in one, he's macheting off your leg with a machete without anesthetic, and doing it in the nicest way possible. But he's like, dude, if I don't chop off... Sorry, hold on. If I don't chop off your leg in the jungle, you're going to get gangrene and you're going to die. So I'm going to chop off your leg, and I'm going to get this machete and just go bash, and I'm going to chop off your leg. Sorry, mate, we're going to have to do this. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, chop. Versus... the terrorist in the street comes along and just goes, smash, I chopped off your leg, what are you going to do about it? And just walks off, right? There's no difference in the result of what happened.
Right.
Or even we could say that you were in the jungle and someone randomly came up to you, and you just normalize everything apart from the intention. The only thing different there is the intention and the morality of how the action was committed. Right, so you're saying the psychological differences are there, which affect the consequences. But I am saying that the consequences are affected by the psychological differences because the action was performed immorally. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
The difference is the fact that the action was immoral.
If you were to completely equalize the outcomes in that the suffering experienced is exactly the same, long-term and short-term, the consequences are exactly the same, then yeah, I would say there's no difference between the two in terms of how bad one is and whether we should prioritize helping one or the other, because I am concerned with the suffering for the individual rather than who is causing or what is causing the suffering. Yeah. I suppose.
Sure.
Go on.
So then in that example, so you end up having to say that there is no difference between a terrorist chopping your leg off and a surgeon chopping your leg off, right?
No. Well, in this very specific example where you've completely equalized all of the psychological effects, and we're not taking into account the fact that if we allow terrorists to continue to do that, it's going to happen to more people, and more individuals will be scared of that happening to them and their loved ones. And in reality, the psychological effects are completely different. But in this hypothetical vacuum, I'm saying that they're the same. Yes, if you equalize the suffering, because that's what I care about. But I guess I kind of wanted this conversation to go on for about an hour, and I think naturally, because we're both so interested in the topic, we've kind of gone over by 40 minutes.
Yeah.
So I guess
sure.
I'll probably leave it there. Is there anything you'd kind of like to finish up on or say before I stop recording?
Well, I guess we should just summarize where we are in the conversation, I guess. Thanks for having me on, and I didn't want it to get too long or too in depth or anything like that. I hope people watching have got interest out of this discussion. I think what has happened here is we both respect each other highly as vegan activists and animal advocates, and I really like you as a person, but we've just got to this clash of core sort of like underlying ethical principles where it just comes down to, I'm not saying it's wrong to go into the forest and help the animals if you can know that is gonna actually not cause more harm than good. But I just don't see it as an obligation. I could see it, maybe it was ethically virtuous, but you want to convince me that I should be committed to care about this, and if I'm committed to veganism, then I should be committed to this. And I just don't think it follows, because at the heart of what the clash is, and the heart of what I care about, is justice, right? And the terrorist who cuts your leg off is doing something unjust, whereas the surgeon isn't. And that is the difference that I care about. I don't really care about the suffering or the pain or the whatever else in the equation. I'm just caring about the justice. And veganism is a movement because of the injustice, what's happening to the animals, whereas the wild animal suffering, for me, that's not anything to do with injustice. That's just, maybe we can do that. Maybe it'll be a nice thing, but it's not an injustice-based thing, whereas veganism is. So that's where I am really in the conversation. I don't really think our positions have changed too much. Yeah. Thank you very much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And I suppose what I'm at, where I'm thinking about your position, is that, so perhaps you're not there, you don't think it's an obligation to help these animals, but at the very least you agree that you shouldn't hinder it. You shouldn't make videos saying it's nonsense or saying that we're going to make things worse necessarily, because where we're at right now is we're just trying to promote research to find out about these animals and how we could possibly help them in the future. Sure. I think I would agree. Like, I could even upload a video saying that I didn't think it's nonsense or something, because I don't think it's nonsense if someone wants to do that. They have the goal and they think it would be a good thing to do, and they really care about that. Like, obviously that's what the person wants to do, right? But I don't think it's a moral obligation, and I think the veganism is more of a urgent thing to address the wild animal suffering, like much more urgent. So that's where my stance is on it. Yeah, sure.